cool dude, and we could probably be friends. But I don't like being jerked around like this. What do they call themselves? Tense had seen that stare before, and it made him instinctively tense up. Every non-human in that room was in genuine danger at that moment, and they all realized it. Noticing the tension, Axika squeezed him and brought him in with a tighter embrace. After a moment of pause, likely from Nan, getting approval for a response from the Singularity Collective, he finally let it out. They call themselves the Nishnade. They've been waiting for over 60 generations to be reunited with their lost family, and well, Nan had been cut off again, but in a far more somber fashion. The once deadly angry expression on his men's face dropped so fast and hard that Tens almost thought the man was going to faint. His medium-tan skin turned just as pale as the woman he was sitting next to. His right eye even looked like it was starting to moisten. Slowly, his empty left hand raised from his hip, and he brought his right hand down. As his face fell into his hands, Tenz's worst fears were beginning to spring forth from his mind. However, despite his vivid and often overactive imagination, nothing could have prepared him for the next 20 minutes of his life. Starting around 730 years ago, the people from the Pale Woman's part of the planet began traveling to what Tenz now knew to be called North America. From his history lessons as a child, he remembered that humanity had dozens, if not hundreds, of various people groups across massive areas of land. But to think that there were actually thousands of distinct self-identifying groups of humans was shocking. And what some of those groups of people did to other groups of people, just because they looked different or spoke a different language, or were just a bit too outside of the norm. It hurt his soul. He knew humans could be horrible, cruel creatures sometimes, but not like this. Tenz always knew the history teachers glazed over some of the worst parts of pre-abduction life, especially for the younger children who couldn't even comprehend living in a world where their very survival would have been in question. His people were nowhere near perfect, and he had his personal complaints about certain traditions that were still enforced. However, he was hearing singular words that had definitions his people wouldn't even consider. Despite learning much of his people's past, he had no experience with learning the horrible truth of history which could compare to what he was hearing now. Even the language being spoken seemed to have inherent contexts and meanings, interpreted through Tenz's translator, that made him feel ill. A massacre wasn't a battlefield incident where soldiers got lost in the heat of the moment against an otherwise equal combatant. It was the intentional wanton destruction against a far weaker foe. A crime against humanity wasn't simply denying a person their inherent rights as a sapient being. It referred to unspeakable acts that Ten simply couldn't imagine doing to another being. Even terms like slavery, which already bore intensely negative connotations, were somehow even worse. The malice of it all dug at him in ways that almost brought tears to his eyes. Even innocent people, the elders and children, were at risk and often the targeted victims. It was the word genocide that hit him the hardest. Very few species in the galaxy had a single word for such acts. And those weren't the kind species. And the worst part of it all, even when things seemed to be turning around, and the fate of his earthbound relatives seemed to be getting significantly better, it all started to crumble again. After that first roughly 500 years of American-European contact, many of these so-called native nations, including ones related to his people, had begun rebuilding. Many found themselves in cultural and economic revivals, and over the course of the next 150 years, had become minor regional powers in their own respect. People who had once lived in squalor began to believe they had a future. The light at the end of the tunnel seemed bright up until around 80 years ago. A slowly growing resurgence of old hateful ideologies and cultural biases had started to gain control over the majority of political and economic powers of Earth. Small governments, independent collectives of people, and any polity or enterprise which didn't adhere to a very particular method of economics were simply abolished. For some reason, TENS did not understand. This included the native nations, the only ones which survived as formal institutions had been the few who had grouped together and sponsored space colonies from which their government could operate. By a strange twist of fate, not only was one of those surviving nations related to his people, the man in that room was part of that nation. The conservation on the recording was continuing, but it had begun to move past information that was relevant to TENS. For all intents and purposes, his people had a direct connection to any of the legally sanctioned government bodies on Earth. Beyond that, due to treatment of native nations and their people, many of the people with cultural connections to his people had ultimately fled to space and helped found Marsgo. There were more Anishinaabe in space than in their home, almost none who actually lived in their traditional homelands. He knew all he needed to know, but he wasn't sure what to do with these horrifying revelations. Axika could feel the burning heat emanating from Tenz's body as he was battling through a storm of emotions. As she ended the recording and set the display tablet off to the side, she used her now free arm to snuggle on to Tenz even tighter. She was fighting back tears, and it wasn't even her people who had been treated that way. However, there was a fear in the back of her mind that this would make Tenz finally lose him composure and control. Embracing him a little tighter, if not better comfort him, at least to better secure him if he were to fly into a rage, Axika rubbed her head against his. "Do you want to talk about it?" Axika finally asked after a long moment of silence. Tenz had to pause to collect himself. "I don't think so. I can't even imagine what that guy is going through. I mean, my family is safe. I could call my great-grandmother right now, and she could tell me beautiful stories that her great-grandmother would tell her. And those stories have been passed on, without interruption, for generations. We have hollow recordings from that very first generation explaining exactly what life was like for them back home. We still have our language and traditions, and we are thriving. And you should be incredibly proud of yourselves. What your people have accomplished is truly inspirational." Akshika spoke with such a genuine and loving tone that it forced a small smile onto Tenz's lips. "We've also been holding back in a lot of ways. Our elder council has consistently made the choice to adhere to the tradition of leaving room for our people, for when they would finally join us. And more importantly, we never wanted to have such a large population, that those alive, when first contact finally happened, would be unable to visit our homeworld before they passed on." Tenz laughed a bit to himself at the absurdity of the concept with the knowledge he now had. It seemed Earth was not quite the welcoming place his people had imagined. "So you think you're gonna be okay?" Again, the genuine love and concern touched Tenz's hurting soul. "Yeah," he said with a laugh. At this point, it was either laugh or cry, and he wasn't much of a crier. Leaning further into Axika, he let his head slowly slip down and moved his face so that it would fall directly into her bosom. "Ha!" Akshika chided, but didn't resist. Well, at least you aren't asking me to send the whole fleet into their system weapons, huh? I was thinking about it. His voice was slightly muffled by the clothed chest. His face was pressed against. No. Aichi. The rebuttal was equal parts, forceful and playful. Tilting her head down to gently kiss the back of Tenza's head, she heard him let out a quiet giggle. Leaning her head back, she brought her arm up and began gently stroking Ten's head. They stayed like that for a few more moments, both trying to find their own peace with what they now knew. Slowly, Tens raised his head from her chest, shifting in his position so could look her straight in the eyes. So, he was hesitant to ask this question, but he needed an answer. Am I allowed to meet them? The Gardens of Deathworlders, Part 5. You've got to be the luckiest asshole I've ever met. Sarah was still upset about one particular thing that happened during the meeting, and she was not going to let it go. In response, Mick simply looked up at her while shoveling a fork full of fish and fried rice into his mouth, while lifting his left arm, while making a mumble sound through his mouth full of food. Exactly. You survived that. We both survived your stupid FTL experiment. You got to fulfill your weird-ass dream of flirting with a cute alien girl, and her voice had been building to the point where that last word was a shout. Sarah took a second to calm herself before continuing. And you're getting a custom-made alien spaceship? And God knows how much alien money out of all this. Again, instead of giving a verbal response, Mick simply made a gesture with both of his arms to imply he was just as shocked by the turn of events as she was. And I didn't get shit. Now she had finally reached the thing she was upset about. I mean, Mick mumbled as he finished the bite he was chewing, I could always make you a t-shirt. I'll write something funny on it like. He was cut off as he dodged French fry being thrown at his head. By the time the fry hit the ground a few meters away, allowed to fly a far greater distance due to the low gravity of the station, both Bitey and Terry were racing towards it like it was a special prize. You should at least give me a shuttle or something, Sarah half mumbled as she picked up one of the fries to actually eat, dipping the thick-cut, golden brown, crispy potato in vinegar. And then taking a big bite, she was still surprised by how good all of Mick's food was. After 2 years on Gibraltar, where even the smallest hint of seasoning was a rare luxury, this much flavor really was a treat. However, it was not just the taste of the meal, it was the entire ambience. The pleasant smells of a kitchen cooking fresh delicacies was being recirculated with air from the adjacent floral section of the agricultural ring. The sweet and subtle notes of smooth synth jazz complemented the bouquet of wonderful fragrances in a way Sarah could hardly describe. The way all her senses were being gently caressed brought her such mental clarity that she was beginning to get lost in herself. Sitting in the dining portion of this ring segment felt somewhat strange to Sarah, as all of the UNE military stations she had been on were far more crowded. Instead of standing room only, the pair were comfortably seated in a cozy booth nestled along one of the walls of the ring segment. The layout and aesthetic was more reminiscent of the pubs back in Scotland, not the overcrowded mess halls of a space station. There were even decorational plants, which Sarah could only assume to be real as they showed signs of recent care. The fresh fish and chips she was eating really sold the experience and almost brought her back to her childhood. The fact that it was fried catfish instead of haddock did somewhat sully the experience, however. The fish wasn't flaky enough and didn't have quite the right flavor. Despite that, it was still a delicious meal. Perfectly salty, with just the right amount of crunch. Across from Sarah, Mick had almost finished his fried rice and seared catfish plate. The fact he had prepared 4 separate meals for the 4 different beings was a bit over the top, but greatly appreciated by all around. The animals, who had long since devoured their own specially prepared meals, were once again back at the table, begging for whatever scraps their pathetic expressions could get them. Though it had been less than 24 hours since being forced back together, the two seemed to be getting along far better than Sarah had expected. She had remembered Mick for being able to keep a grudge better than anyone, and she definitely deserved that treatment. Considering that she hadn't seen Mick with his left arm exposed yet, she wasn't exactly sure what kind of damage was done or what replacement he had gotten. If it was anything like his eye, it was likely a complete mechanical replacement and not a regrown biological limb. Even though she hadn't quite finished her plate, her eyes had proved larger than her stomach, and she was struggling to find room for just one more delicious bite. Pushing her plate away from herself, just out of her own easy reach, she made a slight cough to get Mick's attention. His response, however, left her flabbergasted. Instead of acknowledging her, she watched him immediately grab the last remaining fried fish fillet and take a huge bite out of it. Scoffing at the audacity, she was at least satisfied that she had grabbed his attention without asking for it. "Since you stole my fish," Sarah squinted her eyes at Mick. In mock aggression, "you get to explain to me what?" She paused for a moment, struggling to make sense of the disjointed explanation they had received from the first contact team. "I think the best way to describe it is that there's a bounty system for a whole bunch of different stuff," Mick said while trying to choke down the fried fish he had stuffed into his mouth. "Yeah, what the hell is up with that?" They said they were going to send over something to explain it more, but Sarah was cut off by Mick tapping his left eye with his hand. "I'm reading through it right now, and it kind of makes sense. But I'm going to need a lot of context for some of this stuff, though." Mick had an expression of general confusion as he gestured toward his eye. "What do you mean by context? What happened to more explanation?" Sarah was starting to get suspicious. Mick was hiding something from her. Well, there was a pause as his left eye twitched a few times. "It should be on your tablet now. But what they sent over really just explains how the rewards and distribution works. It doesn't really explain why these bounties exist, who pays them, or any of that." As a realization set in, Mick couldn't help but scoff and start laughing. It's almost like one of those informational brochures the government gives out, not an actual explanation of anything. Reaching into one of the many pockets of the Martian standard pants she had been given as a fresh change of clothes, Sarah pulled out her tablet. With haste, she found the file she had received and opened it. As she started reading, her eyes seemed to light up for a second. With the speed of an aggressive teenager on their social media timeline, Sarah began tearing her finger along the side of the tablet screen until she scrolled down to what she was looking for. Setting her tablet onto the table in a not-so-gentle manner, she impulsively clapped her hands to her mouth to muffle her laughter. "No fucking way. It really is," she exclaimed through her cackling. As she spun the tablet around for Mick to see, his slightly confused expression turned almost sour as he looked at the screen. "Wow." There was a pause as Mick read the final section. Having written dozens of technical briefs himself, this was an all too familiar sight. They really did just send us a And I quote, "For public release document,